It is such a pleasure to be with you all today. And I just want to say a word of gratitude for bwim. As a student of McAfee during the mid-teens or so, I was a student there when the bwim offices were actually on the second floor of the theology building. So I interacted with bwim folks a lot there. I also participated in the 2018 peer mentoring cohort and have been pretty active in Virginia bwim life. So I'm thankful for this space and the work that it has been doing over the years to support women in ministry. I know that I've gotten so much from this space, and I hope I can speak on behalf of many of you in saying that you have also gotten a lot from this space. So it's a pleasure to get to spend some time with you today. I do have a slide presentation because one thing that you will learn about me very quickly is that I am a capital N nerd, and I love to use whatever resources I have to have visual aids, et cetera, in these conversations. Okay, so here is a little bit of where we are going today. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about who I am, so that way you know the context that I'm coming to this conversation. We'll cover a little bit of terminology, and we'll go ahead and share that this terminology is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, just enough to get us on the same page for today's conversation. Then we'll talk about what it looks like to offer care in this season, particularly in American life. And I also have I have three different slides of resources and they're organized. Again, that's how you know I'm a nerd. And then as time allows, we'll open the floor for some questions. One thing that you will notice is not on our agenda today is to go beat by beat through debating biblical interpretation of the clobber passages, which are the handful of Bible passages that get cherry picked to essentially justify homophobia and transphobia. Um, and part of that is because, frankly, on a personal level, debating my right to exist is exhausting. And I have a feeling that many of the women in the room can resonate because, in a way, like you all also have your own clobber passage. I imagine all of you can tell me a story about how someone has weaponized First Timothy against you and the call God has placed on your life. And you know how exhausting those conversations are. So we will talk about a little bit of scripture today, but we're not going to go beat by beat through all the clobber passages. For those of you who do want some resources on engaging with those scriptures, I've included some resources in the resource slides at the end. Okay, because I do want to tend to that need as well. All right. So as Barbara mentioned, I'm a pastor. I currently serve on the pastoral staff at Williamsburg Baptist Church. We are located in Williamsburg, Virginia, and we are about to celebrate our 200th birthday, which is kind of wild. We are an LGBTQ affirming church. Of course, that should hopefully be clear, or else I wouldn't be able to work there. But they've been LGBTQ affirming for at least a decade, if not longer. That history predates me. We are also one of the only churches in our community that is growing right now that I'm aware of. And the demographic that is growing our congregation is LGBTQ plus young adults. And so this conversation around LGBTQ plus care is very tender to me, just because it is so much rooted in the work that I do in my daily life as young adults, as these young adults are discovering themselves and asking questions and just looking for a safe place to have these conversations when they've been told for so many years that the church is not the place for these conversations. Have been working very hard to say, no, this is the place for these conversations. You are welcome to ask these questions here. I'm also the director of the Faithful Pride Initiative at Good Faith Media, where we have two main goals. The first is to center the experiences and expertise of LGBTQ plus people of faith. And the second goal is to create resources for their flourishing. That has looked like a couple of different collaborative processes over the last year because this initiative is only just over a year old. The one that I'm most excited about right now is a grant-funded initiative where we are creating resources for churches who hire queer clergy for the first time. This will be a multimedia resource. One part of that is a book where I have recruited queer clergy from across denominational life to contribute chapters related to what does it look like for churches to update their personnel policy? What does it look like for the church to engage the community if there's some backlash from the community at large for hiring a queer person, and everything from just what does it look like for them to be a hospitable employer. The idea is that this resource is for churches who are already welcoming and affirming, who are supportive of the queer people in their lives, but just may not have thought through the things that they need to take care of on like the personnel side to ensure that their policies actually support an LGBTQ plus family. That book will be supplemented by a podcast where we are going to feature a church that has an all queer clergy staff. Has been doing this work for a while. And so my media producer and I are actually going to Dallas next week to hang out with this church and record it. So I covet your prayers in this busy season. But that's just one example of the work that the initiative does. I'm also a writer. So as Barbara mentioned, I have a book, Reclamation, which is about engaging the clobber passages from a place of LGBTQ plus affirmation. And so what I mean by that is when writing this book, I recognize that many scholars have already done the work of saying the clobber passages aren't actually about LGBTQ plus people, so we should stop using those passages to harm them. And for me, I found that conclusion to be less than satisfying, honestly. Um, because for me, I'm a sucker for redemption. I think that is one of the most beautiful parts of the Christian story. And to me, stopping it at saying these verses shouldn't be used this way, so don't use them that way, lacked the redemption that is so unique to the Christian story. And so I asked the question, well, if we remove the lens of homophobia through which we were introduced to these, what could these verses actually teach us about living fruitful lives of faith? So the book is an attempt to answer that question. I looked at 10 different passages through that lens, and I think I got to a decent place with it, but we'll leave that up to you all. I also have a Substack called Queer Faith, where I routinely look at the intersection between queerness and spirituality, primarily from a Christian lens, just to offer new ways to experience our faith. I know for me, embracing my queerness has made my faith stronger, and I try to identify ways to share that with others. That's on Substack. And then one last thing, I have a lot of hats, and I have a feeling that everyone in this room does too, right? I don't know any clergy people that wear only one hat. So that's what I'm trying to share here. I'm also a wife. And to me, this is probably my most important hat. So this is me and my wife, Haley. We actually met our first year at the Maccabee School of Theology in 2013. I had just broken up with my last boyfriend a week prior to classes starting. I had many things I needed to figure out, obviously. But we will actually be celebrating 9 years of marriage this November. And so when I come to this conversation, I come to it from a place too of how are the ways that our relationship has made us both better people of faith. My wife actually serves as the chair of our adult spiritual formation on our Christian education committee. Um, and offering people opportunities to learn is deeply important to her as well. And our faith is something that's very serious to us. And I don't think that is a narrative that is often heard in like the big public space debate. Like we don't hear a lot from the queer people who are Christians and how embracing their queerness has made them better Christians. Right? And I think we need to hear more of those stories. All right, so some quick terminology. I've only included 4 terms here because these are the terms I think are pertinent to our conversation today, with a disclaimer that language is always evolving. So you all have probably seen the acronym LGBTQ+. That is the most common way you see it referred to, primarily in affirming spaces. If you see people talking about homosexuality, we typically interpret that as a homophobic space. You may see some variations on that acronym, like LGBTQIA. That includes highlighting the intersex and ace spectrum or asexual and aromantic communities that often get overlooked in these discussions. Another common adaptation of this acronym is LGBTQIA2S. The 2S stands for Two Spirit and is strictly an Indigenous term for Indigenous folks who experience a wide range of gender expression. So, like me as a non-Indigenous person, I could not claim that for myself. Um, Another term that I get asked about a lot is queer. And the question that I typically get asked is, well, isn't that a slur? And it used to be, thinking back to the peak of the AIDS crisis back in the 70s and 80s, it was typically used as a way to demean LGBTQ plus people, particularly gay men. In recent decades, it has evolved into kind of a catch-all term to describe both someone's sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. It's also the name that you just see in the academy, right? So if you are studying queer theory, that's the name of the discipline, or queer theology, that is also the name of the discipline. And so there's a mixed response in the LGBTQ plus community. I personally enjoy using the word queer for myself, partially because of the redemptive power of taking the word back, but also because it condenses trying to describe to someone how I understand my sexuality and my gender expression. Being able to just condense it into one syllable makes the conversation go a little easier. But if you ask some of the older folks in my congregation, specifically some of our older gay men who remember how miserable the AIDS crisis was, it's not a word that they will claim for themselves. They absolutely support our younger folks reclaiming it and using it for themselves and finding power in it, but they're not going to throw that word around. So with that one, I would say, like use your discretion in talking with folks and let them tell you if that's a word that's comfortable for them. Another word we've been seeing a lot in the media is transgender or trans, and that is an umbrella term for anyone whose gender does not align with their gender assigned at birth. So this would include people who identify as non-binary, genderqueer, gender nonconforming, etc. We often see this shortened as trans. This word has broadly replaced the word transvestite, which is now widely considered offensive. The one exception to that rule, I think, would be a sing along to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Right. So outside of that, we use transgender. And then cisgender or cis is a term to describe someone whose gender identity is consistent with their gender assigned at birth. So you hear some rhetoric about like, oh, well, the queer community has invented this new slur, cis. That's not what it is at all. It's just getting to Latin roots describing that I'm pretty sure the Latin root means aligns, right? So it's align with how you were identified as birth. And again, disclaimer, language is always evolving. I feel like I'm always learning about a new pronoun or a new categorization or subcategorization. And so when engaging new terms, I encourage you to invite curiosity. Okay. So now that we've kind of done our introductions, we've covered a little bit of terminology here. A question that has been really forming how I put this conversation together. Why should churches care about LGBTQ specific care? Times are hard for everybody. Shouldn't we just focus on caring for everybody? And to that, it feels a little bit like equalizing and saying all of our struggles are the same. We all have struggles, but that doesn't make them equal. And times are really scary. It is a scary time to be out in America right now. One reason that I would argue churches should care about LGBTQ specific care is because of all of the threats we're seeing. These are just a handful of news headlines from like the past 2 weeks. That doesn't include a law that was passed in Ohio late last week, criminalizing wearing makeup in public spaces if that makeup does not align with your gender identity. And that crime, you could be punished with jail time for wearing makeup in a public space. I wish I was making this up. It also does not include the recently renewed effort to overturn Obergefell v. Hodges. Earlier this year, a group calling themselves the Greater Than Campaign formed, launched, and are exclusively working to overturn the Supreme Court decision that legalized marriage equality using kids as political pawns. Their argument is that kids need both a mom and a dad at home in order to have full, fruitful lives. And it's unfortunately well funded and supported by folks like Al Mohler and others of his ilk. So being out as an LGBTQ plus person and just seeing these news headlines just day after day after day after day, it wears on you and communicates that you are not welcome in public space and you're not welcome to exist. On top of this external just pressure and awfulness we're feeling, there's also what we get individually. I considered including a slide of homophobic comments that I've received on posts that I've posted or have received in direct messages, but that felt a little overkill for today, and I did not want to bring down the mood that much. But I know that I'm not the only one experiencing that. I have conversations with church members all the time about just what they're getting from their family, what they're getting at work. And that compounded with what we're seeing on the state and federal level is posing them to, or putting them in a place to ask questions like, do I need to get an immigration lawyer? Should I consider applying for asylum? Do you and your wife have a contingency plan, or am I overreacting? So churches, I think, need to have some dedicated space to care for the LGBTQ plus people in their lives because of how overwhelming all of that is. I know that we don't have all of the answers, but being able to provide a space where they can be vulnerable about how all of this is impacting them is important. Whenever I bring up things like this, though, inevitably the question that comes up is, why are you bringing politics into church? Church is not the place to talk about politics. And I take issue with that question when it's in response to these things, because first we're talking about people, right? We're not talking about politics. We're talking about the realities that are harming people's lives. And there is, in public discourse, a double standard regarding who is considered political and who is not. And so an example that I threw up here is how it's interpreted when my straight colleague talks about his wife versus when I talk about mine. When he talks about his wife in public, absolutely normal. I bring up my wife, all of a sudden I'm talking politics. And it's not just with LGBTQ folks, right? Depending on the context, any body can be considered a quote political body by an oppressive power, right? When I have a good friend who is a cisgender woman who lives in Tennessee, and over the last several years, there have been so many laws criminalizing access to reproductive care. And when she and her husband were pregnant last year, she was terrified about like what would happen if something went wrong with her pregnancy. And she would share about that on Facebook sometimes, and people would comment on her post, "Why are you talking politics?" Right? When she's not talking politics, she's talking about her health and her concerns about starting her family. Right? So for me, it's the reality is there are some people who are weaponizing politics in order to harm people and then slapping a "we don't talk about politics at church" band-aid over it in order to avoid having these hard conversations. So in order to tend to the hurt that we're seeing in the LGBTQ plus community, we have to be honest about where the harm is coming from. And it's coming from this weaponization of politics, right? I know that that feels like a really delicate line to walk, and it may feel more or less delicate depending on your congregation. But I do think that there should be space to talk about what is actually political and why do we consider these things political. The second reason why I think churches really need to be intentional about LGBTQ plus care is that we are part of the body of Christ. And here's where we are going to get into a little bit of scripture today. So a verse that is getting thrown around a lot right now, especially as we're seeing more laws criminalize transgender people, is Genesis 1. God created humans in their image, male and female, God created them. right? People will look at that verse and say, well, this is it. The Bible clearly says that there are only two genders, right? And in his book, Transforming the Bible and the Lives of Transgender Christians, Austin Hartke offers us a way to break down this passage of scripture to highlight for us the ways in which we are inconsistent when we translate this verse compared to the verses that come up previously. For example, he talks about how in that same Genesis narrative, there's a quote, clear and definitive binary. God separates the waters and creates the land and the sea. So when we see that, we could argue the only things that exist are land and sea. But Austin reminds us, what about bogs and marshes? You know, they're too wet to walk on, but they're too dry to swim through. Are they abominations simply for existing? Of course, we don't think that. We recognize that they are part of God's beautifully diverse creative design, and they fit somewhere along this binary between land and sea. Even though the Bible doesn't explicitly name them, we know that they exist and we know that they're good. And so Austin does this with a couple other, basically that whole Genesis narrative. So animals of the land, birds of the sky. I also know that that verse mentions fish of the sea. I didn't have enough room on the slide. But again, creating this clear distinction, like animals stay on the land, birds stay in the sky. Well, then what are we to do with penguins and platypi, which I think is the plural of platypus, right? Penguins are a flightless bird. Are they abominations because they can't be like their other brethren in the sky? Of course, we don't think that, right? And so he lays out these questions to really challenge us to say, we already recognize that all of these things are part of God's creation. Why can't we do the same with gender expansive people? And in that chapter, he also highlights a conversation that he had with a friend. And his friend said, when we say that God is the Alpha and the Omega, we don't mean that God is only the Alpha and only the Omega, only the beginning or only the end. We're saying that God is everything from Alpha through Omega and beyond, right? And to me, that's where this verse from Galatians really comes into play. I know we don't always like Paul, but every now and then he hits something right, where I don't think he's saying that these categories of people don't exist anymore. But I think he's saying that the rigidity that defines the way we categorize people needs to break away so that we can understand ourselves as part of one body. So, two reasons why LGBTQ, why churches should care about LGBTQ plus care. One, times are hard right now. And two, we're part of the body of Christ. We belong here. Okay. So I do want to have a conversation about what it looks like to create spaces to have these hard conversations. Or if you are thinking about folks who may not be as open or receptive to talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion, but also creating safe space where an LGBTQ plus person can be vulnerable and bring their full selves to church. And the first thing that I would highlight is that there's been a movement in the last few years to stop using the phrase safe space. And I just used it right now on accident. The reason is we can't guarantee the safety of the space at all times. That's a promise we can't make good on. Because unfortunately, we can't control everyone in the room. You know, wish we could sometimes, but we can't. The more honest commitment is, or a more honest way to frame it, is our commitment to create a brave space where everyone feels empowered to bring their full authentic selves to the table, where we can have hard conversations and know that we will be respected, right? That I feel like is a more honest way to frame it. You know? And in these spaces, you know, we want to also highlight people's intent. You know, I, you know, being in the congregation that I am in, we've had many conversations where I think some folks have asked the question that in other contexts would have been interpreted as inflammatory, but because we know this person, we have a relationship with this person, we know that the intent was good, even if the vocabulary was maybe a little wrong, right? That's not always the case in all these places. Some folks do ask harmful questions in order to be inflammatory. So, a question that I would encourage you all to sit with is, how can we cultivate an atmosphere where it is safe to assume good intent of the participants? You know, what does it look like to create those boundaries? And sometimes when we're having a challenging conversation in Sunday school class, or we're doing a series on a sensitive topic, we will actually pass around a class covenant that the group has made together. And before we begin conversation, we will read through the covenant line by line, which highlights things like, I understand that for some in the room, this conversation is not theoretical. They have a personal stake in the conversation. I understand that other people have experiences different from my own, and I will believe their experiences and respect them. I will assume good intent, right? And so like we explicitly name the guidelines for the conversation before we start. And I think that's a good way to just kind of set the mood and say, here's what we're going to expect in this conversation. Um, Another less pleasant question to sit with is, if ill intent is suspected, what is our plan for addressing it? Are we going to ask that person to leave the room? Are we going to say, hey, we can talk about this at another time, but we're actually going to move the conversation in a different direction now? If you want to talk about this with me more as your pastor, we can set up a time to talk about it this week, right? So, what is the plan for addressing if we suspect that ill intent was the goal of the question or how it was framed? When it comes to creating those brave spaces as well, I want us to think too, both about the private spaces, so like the conversations that you have in your office with folks, and corporately, like a Sunday school setting, small group setting, etc. And so I think part of it is there's assumptions on many sides, right? The church is becoming more and more a place in some places where people feel comfortable having conversations about gender and sexuality, right? And so, is that the case in your congregation? Do your members know that they can come talk to you one on one about questions that they have and not feel judged? Or are you having to kind of battle the old assumption that church is not the place where we talk about this, right? And what are the ways that you can vocally combat that assumption? You know. Secondly, how's your poker face? Right? I think all clergy need a good poker face, because sometimes we hear things that are very surprising to us. And I say this too as an LGBTQ plus person who ministers to LGBTQ plus people. I've been doing research recently and have found that in some communities, folks are using the pronouns it's for them, like it, for themselves. And that is new to me. And when I first saw that, my knee jerk reaction was to dismiss it as them just claiming the objectification that is happening from oppressive folks who use dehumanizing language to talk about trans people. But the reality is, I don't know why some folks are using those pronouns for themselves. So, even in my context, as someone who does ministry with LGBTQ people all the time, as a queer person, I'm still learning things and encountering things that are unexpected. So, keeping that poker face, though, I want them to know that I am a safe place to have these conversations. And if I, have shock or disgust on my face, that sense of safety is gone, right? And then, so following up on the poker face question, what's your commitment to learning something new when confronted with the unexpected, right? I think, like I'm personally going to be going on this journey to understand why some people use those pronouns, so I can have an informed conversation if any of my folks come to me with that. And so thinking through the people who are in your context, what are some of the unexpected things that you've been confronted with recently? And what's your commitment to learning more about them? Corporately, I think, how do we celebrate difference? how do we respect a difference in small group gatherings? So thinking through if a trans person is in the middle of transitioning, attending Sunday school class, and has identified a new name for themselves. How do we recognize that new name, and do we gently correct people who use that person's dead name or the name that they no longer use? In a more corporate setting like worship, our tools for recognizing differences normalize. One thing that is just part of the culture here at Williamsburg Baptist Church is anytime someone gets up to the pulpit, they introduce themselves and we ask them to share one thing about themselves, maybe how long they've been at the church or something like that. I would say 9 times out of 10, people share their pronouns, even if they are straight and cisgender. And so just having that as part of a normal experience in the church, though, I have lost count of the times that someone said that they were a visitor and they kept coming back and eventually joined. But the thing that made them feel comfortable coming back was hearing folks share their pronouns in the pulpit. That signaled to them that this was a place where difference was celebrated and recognized. So just thinking through, like, what are some of those things in your context that could go that way? And then this is the last piece of it before we get into some resources, and then we'll get into some conversation. One thing that I would challenge everyone here to do is to make sure that your stance on LGBTQ inclusion is clearly communicated on your website, no matter. I apologize, I'm a little froggy today and got a little bit of a cough. And this goes for everyone, affirming churches included. So a couple of years ago, I was attending a virtual presentation that Cody Sanders was giving on his then new book, Christianity, LGBTQ plus Suicide, and the Souls of Queer Folk. And in this book, he interviewed several folks who were LGBTQ plus folks and survivors of suicide attempts. It's a beautiful book, very heavy. And he talked with a lot of them about how faith played a role either in the attempt or their recovery. And so he was talking with a participant who was in his, I think, late 50s, early 60s, who said that he loved God so much and that he knew that God loved him even though he was gay, but he knew no church would accept him. And so, like, if there was a church that would accept him, he would go. Cody stopped the interview, took the man to the sidewalk outside, pointed at a church across the street, pointed at their marquee, and the marquee said, "We are a welcoming and affirming congregation." And he asked the man, "Do you know what that means?" And he said, "No." It's a beautiful phrase, but I have no idea what it means. And the phrase welcoming and affirming is beautiful language. It is beautiful language, but it is language that the church made. It doesn't mean anything outside the context of the church, right? And so if you all are welcoming and affirming congregation, that's great. You also need to use words and symbols that are recognized outside of church spaces. It's kind of like the word fellowship, right? We all have our fellowship hall. No one says outside of church spaces, "Yeah, I'm going to call up my friends so we can fellowship together," right? Probably the only context outside of the church where we hear the word fellowship is if we're talking about the fellowship of the ring, right? And so it's a recognition that our language needs to reflect, like, if we are serious about wanting LGBTQ plus people to know that they are welcome in this space, we need to use the words and symbols that are recognizable. And kind of the blessing and the curse, I think, of the LGBTQ plus community is we come with our own branding. You put a rainbow on it and people know that this is a place for us. Um, and that's something that I would just offer for consideration. For non-affirming churches, I would also encourage you to make your stance clearly known. Don't make people guess. If you say that we believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, some folks may read that and assume, oh, that means you're also non-affirming. But they shouldn't have to do this guesswork, right? I think it is, I don't think it is a big ask to make that clearly known on your website so that they can make a decision for themselves that is rooted in honesty. And for our unsure churches or some of our purple churches, I would encourage you to make your uncertainty known on your website. I would also encourage you to enter an intentional season of discernment. And I know that for many folks who serve in purple churches, that is a big ask. Um, but I want to offer two hypothetical scenarios that are rooted in reality. Imagine that your congregation hasn't made any kind of decision either way on how you feel about LGBTQ plus inclusion. And a teenager in your youth group comes out as trans and they want to be baptized with their new name. Another hypothetical scenario, a young, like a lesbian couple who is new, has been coming for a while, loves the space, decides not only they want to join the church, but they would like to get married in that church. If your congregation hasn't done the hard work of sifting through those conversations and decisions themselves, one, they're not going to be forced to, and two, these individuals are going to be at the center of it. So, however challenging or scary it feels to have those conversations now when no one's at the center of it, I want you to imagine how it is for the individuals in the center, particularly the youth, and knowing that all the anger and the debates and the back and forths are happening, quote, because they said something. You know, like it's not fair for congregations to put that emotional labor on other individuals. Um, so that feels scary. That's okay. But it's something that I would challenge you to sit with and figure out how to facilitate those conversations. And some of the resources I'm going to suggest might be good starting points. So for those who want to learn more or dig into more, I do have some resources. So I have a million of them. So if you've read any of these, like please feel free to reach out to me and I can recommend more. Again, I'm a big old nerd and I've read more books on any of this than is probably healthy. So a couple of the things I would highlight here. Cody actually released an updated edition of his youth ministry guide that includes a chapter discussing the growing Venn diagram that overlaps um, queerness and neurodivergence in our young people. So I definitely recommend that resource. The updated edition. Their own Receive Them Not is specifically about the experiences of gay and lesbian folks within the Black church context and how navigating those spaces are challenging for them. So that is also a really good read. And then the Pray Away Netflix documentary, that one does not offer any strategies for care, but I included it here anyway because with the Supreme Court decision last week overturning the conversion therapy ban in Colorado, conversion therapy is going to be in public conversation more and more and more. There are 20 some odd states with similar laws on the books that are probably going to be challenged as a result to last week's decision. And there are a lot of people who don't know what conversion therapy is. And because they hear that it's to get people to stop being gay, they say, great, we should have it in churches. But they don't realize the real harm that is behind the practices, psychologically, sometimes even physically. So the documentary Pray Away chronicles the rise and fall of what was the largest international faith-based conversion therapy group, Exodus International. So they interviewed folks who founded it and then walked away from the work. All of the folks who started Exodus International were gay and claimed to be ex-gay, and most of them are now happily partnered in queer relationships. Um, but it is, I will preface, I will offer a disclaimer. It is a very heavy watch. So if you do watch it, make sure to have some time to be tender to yourself afterwards. There are really frank conversations about suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and self-harm. But I think as these conversations about conversion therapy ramp up, you may find yourself longing to be equipped to have an informed conversation about it. Okay, so for those of you who do want to engage the clobber passages, here are some resources. The Bible, Gender, and Sexuality is probably where I would start. That is not a very lay-friendly book, so I wouldn't be handing that out to congregants who have questions. Everything else on here is pretty lay-friendly. In fact, 1906 might be a good kind of anchor for a church-wide conversation. That documentary is about how the word homosexual ended up in English translations of the Bible, because prior to the year 1946, the word homosexual was not in the Bible. So it chronicles the story of how exactly that happened, when it was removed from the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, but by that point it was kind of too late in terms of how quickly other translations that use the Revised Standard Version as kind of their foundation took it and ran with it. So that is, again, very palatable for a lay audience as well. And then for those of you who are curious, like I said several times throughout the conversation today, that I feel like embracing my queerness has made me a better person of faith. I'm not the only one who feels that way, and the field of queer theology is growing and blossoming. So a couple of things I would highlight on this slide is if queer theology is new to you, I would suggest starting with Rainbow Theology by Patrick Cheng. Basically, what he did in that book is he broke queer theology into a couple of different subsections and then highlighted the work of a couple of authors within each of those subsections. So the book is basically a literature review of a whole bunch of other resources that you could check out. So it's a really good way to just kind of get your toe in and learn kind of what's out there before committing to like someone's individual work. And then you'll notice I have another book on this slide. I did not include the title because I promised my paid Substack subscribers that they will get the title first, and I want to make sure to do good on that promise to them. But I can tell you what it is about. It is a book that explores the life and ministry of Jesus from a queer perspective. So looking at themes in Jesus' life that could be interpreted as queer, how that deepens our understanding of who Jesus is. But also the goal of this book is so that LGBTQ plus folks can see the divinity of Christ within them, because they see their experiences mirrored in Jesus' life and ministry. That's the goal anyway. So last I checked with my publisher, we are on track for a release date in either July or August. So coming soon. And before we open it up for questions, I do want to invite y'all to stay in touch. Here's some ways that you can contact me. That QR code will take you to a link tree that has all of these links except for my Good Faith Media email address. So if any of y'all want to have further conversations or want some more resources or would like for me to come talk to your church about something or anything like that, you can email me, Callie at goodfaithmedia.org.